From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and ahead for you today, K-State's Dan O'Brien on the various predictions on row crop acreage to be planted in the U.S. this spring ahead of the USDA's planting intentions report later this month, and how all of that figures into Dan's latest price probability projections for corn and soybeans. Also today, K-State's Walt Fick discussing managing grasslands following a wildfire in the wake of numerous fires flaring up around Kansas of late. Walt will also talk about the consequences of conducting a prescribed burn of native pasture earlier than normal this spring. And further ahead on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp, along with much more, here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. You're listening to Agriculture Today, our Friday edition, as always. Thanks for being along with us. The grain markets are our first order of business, and we'll touch base once again with grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension. Dan, of course, is stationed in northwest Kansas out of his office in Colby. Dan, we're going to get into your latest price probability projections for corn and soybeans as we go along here, but we do see now folks taking an early shot at those expected plantings ahead of the USDA's report due out at the tail end of this month, getting some numbers floating out there as to which crops may be planted to what extent across the countryside. You're watching those too and have some thoughts.
Well, I'm springboarding off of what the USDA said in their Outlook conference, and they'd indicated that soybeans were going to be up about 7% and corn was going to be up 1%. And you and I have talked about how in the past there were some farmer surveys that kind of flipped that a little bit, showing soybeans up 2, 3, 4% and corn up more like, instead of 1% like the USDA said, more like 2, 3, or 4%. So more, if anything, the farmer surveys are more balanced between the two, whereas the USDA went to the polls. So I think that upon reflection, when you look at why the USDA put that 7% number out there for soybeans, I think it has a lot to do with just how tight stocks are projected to be. Because when I work at putting those scenarios on paper and figuring, for instance, for soybeans, just take a look at it while we're here. If you plug in the USDA's projection, 7% higher acres, then you go from 83 million in 2021 up to about 90 million. And then you adjust a little bit for harvested acres, plug in a decent yield, 50.8 bushels per acre. You end up with the ability to basically keep crush and exports about where they're at. A little bit of adjustment higher for crush, about 50 million bushels, not much in the big scheme of things, lower for exports. And you end up with stocks to use at 145 million bushels for that next mark, and you're 120 in this year. And prices at about $11.25, again, 3.2% stocks to use, et cetera. So why did the USDA put 7% higher soybean acres? You know, when I look at scenarios like 2 to 4.5% higher acres, there's no way to maintain 100 million bushels of carryout at the end of that without having to crunch back to some degree. I say crunch, either more or less, but still reductions either way in both exports and crush. So I think they put that number out there to basically balance the balance sheet. I've heard other analysts say that what we're shaping up to have, given these tight old crop ending stocks, which have become the really tight new crop beginning stocks, we're in a situation where we have to thread the needle and have a tremendous crop year. Because if we don't, we'll have price rationing and moderate to severe, depending on what we actually have. And, you know, pretty dry in parts of the western corn belt and concerns in northern Iowa again. So what the USDA had done by putting that 7% there and coming in with 50.8 or almost 51 bushels per acre, which was towards the highest we've seen, is basically, I think it's an effort to balance the balance sheet.
How does that parlay then, Dan, into your probability projections for soybeans?
Well, I think that the planted acres number will give the USDA their due this early on, with strong soybean prices. We've got old crop bids, as we talk, we're above $14. But the new crop bids out there in November are about 80-some cents, 70, 80 cents below that at $12.44, $12.43, something like that. That's yesterday's numbers. So how's that parlay into what the markets will do? Well, I think you take what the futures are showing for new crop bids, again, somewhere around $12.40, $12.50, thereabouts. And if we get all that the USDA has said, and they projected the price at $11.25 a bushel. If we get 2% planted acres increase instead of 7, then you're heading for 12 or above 12 for an average price. So that's the stakes. Then 4.5% planted acres, and with some rationing going on, you're hovering around 11.5, something like that. But the outcome to really be thoughtful about is we come in at 11:01 on the last day of March, and that planting intentions survey comes in and says, well, we're more like 2% higher soybeans. No, we're going to plant more corn. People they go straight to the balance sheet, start calculating this, and figure out, oh my gosh, we're going to have to ration something to get to the end of this. So I think that's why the USDA put 7% out there, which, if we put 7% higher beans, well, there's only X amount of land in the United States. We have a lot of land, but there's still just that much of it around. So they came out and put 1% higher corn acres from 90.8 million up to basically 92, which is a lot of acres, still more than soybeans, but that 1% is less than some of the farmer surveys we'd seen earlier. So again, what's that number going to be? And what they did, they put in 179.5 bushels per acre as a U.S. yield, and 176 or so is the highest we've seen. So another thread the needle type of a situation. You got to have not just a good yield, you have to have a record wonderful yield to make this thing work out. And in doing so, they basically took last year's ending stocks, 1.502 billion, and added 50 to it, 50 million, and did that without a lot of rationing. In fact, they jumped up their ethanol projection. They jumped up their feed residual use projection, and also raised their export numbers. So if you come back and say, well, I see where our use is at now, and I wonder where all this would go, they raised those usage amounts and lowered the projected price by a dime from $4.30 to $4.20. So it's not that this can't happen, but boy, things have got to fall right for this thing to work out and to end up and to be able to go from 1.5 billion up to 1.55 and to not see things really hop around. I've got a couple scenarios where I look at not just 1% higher planted acres, but more like 2.5 and up to 4.5. And that can happen. Really, I think what we're going to find out is farmers that know how to grow corn and can do a great job of it, do they stay with what they know and what they perceive to be risky times, or do they shift around more and go to other crops? But anyway, if you get more like 2.5% higher acreage or 4.5, for the 2.5% higher deal, then instead of 4.20, well, about 4.10, as a price. You're down about a dime. If you get to 4.5% higher acres, then at least by my thinking and back calculations and seeing what fits, then your stocks to use go from about 10.3 up to about 12.7, and your price is probably closer to 375, 380.
So that's your worst case scenario then on corn.
Well, the worst case is much worse than that, probably, but
reasonably speaking.
But that's assuming 175 bushels an acre. You could still have higher acres and have a dry year and have a lot higher prices. But so I guess, as you can tell, I get all energetic about dealing with the uncertainties that these markets are facing. By the way, as you look at the numbers, the USDA projected basically a 20% increase in grain sorghum acres. farmers. They're thinking that in these drier areas that you'll see more grain sorghum being planted. And that's symptomatic of not just the current tremendous basis, but the new crop bids. We haven't talked about what's been happening in South America in terms of delayed, reduced quality now, soybean harvest out of good chunks of Brazil, dryness in Argentina, rains forecast. But we in Western Kansas, we view forecast as somebody's opinion until it happens. Right. And that's sort of where they're at there. The markets have, again, rains to come and help that situation. And hopefully they do, but that's on the come. We haven't talked about wheat yet.
And we should, because wheat clearly is keyed fully in on conditions in the Central Plains and elsewhere, which have been dry up to this point. Hopefully that'll change this weekend.
It's command performance. We've broken dormancy. We've either done it or we're doing it. Some hot, dry conditions with moisture forecast. So the track of those storms, the quantity that's come, et cetera, it's all important. And I would say that the dryness we've had has, well, how can it not have reduced subsoil in some of these western Kansas areas? Worse in west central, I think, and southwest. Still tough in those areas, and on into eastern Colorado, et cetera. So 50 hundredths isn't going to replenish the soil profile. You just live to fight another day. Boy, you need more like 2.5 or something to really right the ship and to alleviate some of the dry condition worries we have out here in the West. So in 2 weeks, we'll have a lot more accurate view of what we actually have for prospects, and a lot of that will depend on the rainfall that we do or don't get during that time frame.
Dan, of course, has his full notes on the grain markets, including his latest price probability projections for corn and soybeans, as we covered right here, in his weekly notes at agmanager.info. Be sure to have a look at those producers. And Dan, thanks as always for your time.
Thank you, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, with his weekly observations on the grain trades here on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Next up on Agriculture Today, a glance to managing grasslands in the aftermath of a wildfire. And we've been discussing the last several weeks the potential for wildfire outbreaks in rural Kansas, and unfortunately those have come to fruition in all too many locations in the state. Stopping by once more, Walt Fick, Range and Pasture Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll get to, Walt, the post-wildfire management considerations in just a moment. But before we do, let's take on a very much related topic, and that is the pros and cons of burning native pastures early. And we've likely some pasture managers out there that are pondering that for one reason or the other.
Yeah, you look back historically, I think the Flint Hills in particular, they used to burn them end of February, and then as we did more research and so forth, and then, kind of settled on into later in the spring, the late spring burning has been promoted whenever that occurs, and we time that based on when the grass first starts growth, maybe even have an inch or so of growth on big blue stem or Indian grass. That would be late spring. But right now, here we are in mid-March or so, and that would be considered to be a fairly early spring burn, or really a late dormant season burn yet at this point in time. And of course, I think the key difference in terms of that timing is there's a potential, if you're burned too early, you remove the old material, leaves the ground bare, and before things really start growing, you can lose some soil moisture, and that can result in reduced yield. That doesn't always happen, but it kind of depends on how much moisture you get here the next month or so. But it can reduce forage production when you burn earlier. The other thing, of course, we've seen with stalker gains is that there seems to be a fairly significant difference. If we don't burn, and then compared to late spring burn, that long-term average is about 32 pounds per animal. But now if you look at burning, let's say in this mid-March time frame, or even into the latter part of the month compared to a late spring, now you're looking at maybe 20 pounds. And I think a couple of years ago we've started actually going back and looking at these studies again. And I know our Bresner pastures down by Yates Center, they burned around I think it was the 15th of March and versus April 10th, and they had a 20-pound difference in animal gains. So it can happen. Last year they weren't able to burn quite as early as they wanted to, and they didn't see any difference. But, if there's a 3-week difference, I think you'll see that 20 pounds difference in gain and maybe even more. But I think 20 pounds would be a reasonable amount. The other drawback, I think, from burning too early, you aren't going to do much for brush and weed control. The brush species aren't leafed out yet, so it's hard to do much damage to them during that situation. The exception, of course, would be eastern red cedar. If you can get them ignited anytime, it can be successful. In fact, one of the advantages, some people, they might want to manage for more broadleaf species. Burning early actually is a benefit to those. You aren't going to set those back as much as you would with a later burn. So burning in March, this early time frame, it does remove the thatch. It'll probably improve any grazing distribution patterns that you may have had the previous years. So it does have some advantages. But the main problem compared to a later burn, I think, is that lack of brush control and reduced stalker gains and possibly reducing forage production.
So weigh the consequences if one is intent on burning early before you light that match. What to do with grasslands that have been cleared by wildfire and how to manage those after the fire and as we get into the grazing season. This is something that needs to be handled a bit differently, does it?
There's a lot of factors that affect the management following wildfire. Key one of those would be when did that fire occur. Most of the wildfires occur, either in the fall or in the early springtime, November through March. Here, 2 or 3 years ago, our 2 biggest wildfires we ever had occurred during the month of March. And so they're earlier than growth is probably occurring. Those wildfires, they occur under conditions that aren't real conducive to burning normally, because when we do a prescribed burn, we kind of select the conditions under which you want to burn. Wildfires, they happen, there's high winds, low humidities, temperatures are actually higher. And again, this year here in Kansas and in many places, we had a pretty good growing season last year. So there's lots of fuel out there, and that also adds to it. And when it's not greened up at all, it doesn't take much to get it ignited, and consequently, you can have a wildfire.
And will that wildfire impede the response of the grass once it starts to emerge at all?
Again, there's some differences in timing. A lot of the data we have goes back to some March fires and fall fires. There's one case they compared with November. March fires at Hayes was studied pretty significantly a couple different times in our past. Of course, that's more an area dominated by short grasses. Mm-hmm. And, buffalo grass, blue grama, frankly, don't respond very well to fire, particularly not when it's early like that in let's say, March. Bunch grasses, little blue stem. If you have an area with little blue stem, a bunch grass, that fire goes through there, set there and smolders pretty hot on that crown. So it's another species that tends to be decreased. I think the one study, it said little blue stem was decreased by 49%. Its production was that same year. Wow. So fairly significant reduction. The other thing, it affects species composition, but then also greatly reduces yield in many cases. And I know that March fire I'm thinking about near Hayes, it actually reduced yields 65 to 77%, that summer following the fire. And yields were still reduced the following year by like 39%. Of course, the consequence of that, if you have reduced yields, you're probably going to need to start reducing stocking rates.
If we see wildfires from here forward, here we are talking on March the 12th, the chances of grass being negatively impacted start to lessen some?
Yes, I think that's true. If we're actually getting closer to the time we normally would burn, yes, I think the impacts are generally going to be less. A lot of the vegetative response, though, does rely on what sort of precipitation we get following the fire event. Again, right now, what's the prediction for the next 90 days? I think it's predicted to be below normal precip. So if you have a wildfire, even here in March, and it doesn't rain for a while, that's going to have more of a negative effect. Now, maybe if we start getting rain when May rolls around, maybe it just delays the forage production a little bit. You may still have to reduce stalking rates, or we may just simply have to delay when we start grazing. That would be another possibility.
Well, to the stalking rate adjustments then, to what extent does one reduce those? What do we have in concrete numbers that we can work with here?
Well, again, based on that reduced forage production I mentioned, where you're getting, maybe 60% reduction of season following a wildfire, that's probably what you ought to look at for reducing your stalking rates. So that first year, particularly you get in central and western Kansas, the plant composition is such that we have species that are more apt to be hurt by the fires. Here in the Flint Hills, we've got rhizomatous species, big bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass. They're not harmed as much by a fire, those wildfires that we see further west. So that first year, we may have to reduce stalking rates, and maybe in western central Kansas, even the second year, we might still have to look at some reduction, but maybe not as great. Flint Hills, again, our grasslands developed with fire, so that they're pretty resilient, and they recover pretty well. But still, even in the Flint Hills, a wildfire during that dormant period, we might have to look at reducing stalking rates 10 or 15%.
Aligned with this, then, Walt, does one need to pay extra attention to grazing distribution to make sure that all is consumed as evenly as possible?
That kind of depends on how much of a given pasture has been burned. If a portion of the pasture has been burned, we know that recent fire attracts the grazing animals to that new growth, and so they're going to concentrate their grazing there. If it's a fairly significant portion of the pasture, sometimes we would recommend maybe just fencing off the burn area, manage it separately from what area that hasn't been burned. Of course, you need to have water, in both situations then. So that's one option. Central and eastern Kansas in particular, we've been using or promoting patch burn grazing. And so, maybe if a portion, maybe a third of that pasture, so third to half burns, you could just go to the patch burn philosophy, knowing that they're going to concentrate on that area. If you're in an area where you typically would burn, the next year you burn the rest of the pasture, and they'll concentrate their grazing there. And that seems to be an option, at least maybe in the eastern part of the state. You can put your salt and mineral and things like that in an area that's unburned to attract animals out of the burned area to that, and that'll help grazing distribution as well.
Again, that publication is entitled Rangeland Management Following Wildfire. If you go to the K-State Research and Extension website, ksre.ksu.edu, type in that title, and it'll take you right to this good, comprehensive publication on this topic. Walt, thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
Walt Fick is a range and pasture management specialist with K-State Research and Extension on a couple of aspects of pasture management here. Once again, the merits, or perhaps lack thereof, of early burning that grass if you do follow a prescribed fire regimen, and what to do about pastures that may have been dinged by a wildfire. This is Agriculture Today, and we'll be back with more on the K-State Radio Network.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Now in its 97th year of broadcast service to agriculture, this is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. For you now, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The U.S. International Trade Commission determined yesterday that phosphate fertilizer imports from Morocco and Russia have affected the U.S. market, and a countervailing duty should be placed on imports from those countries. That ruling comes a month after the U.S. Department of Commerce recommended the countervailing tariffs on imported phosphorus fertilizer should be instituted. The Commission vote 4-1 in favor of the countervailing duties, the Department of Commerce issuing the duty orders on phosphate fertilizers for at least 5 years. The rates for such imports are expected to be approximately 20% for Moroccan producer OCP, 9% for Russian producer Fosagro, 47% for Russian producer Eurochem, and 17% for all other Russian producers. That's according to a news release from Mosaic. Now, Mosaic, of course, is a leading fertilizer vendor in the U.S. It filed petitions back in June of last year to request the start of countervailing duty investigations. The company maintained foreign subsidies are unfair and that these duties would restore competition in the U.S. market. Leaders from the American Soybean Association, the National Corn Growers Association, and National Cotton Council of America had written the International Trade Commission last month warning that the tariffs on imported phosphate fertilizers would adversely affect crop production in the U.S. The commodity groups warned that these new duties on imported phosphate fertilizers would raise prices more than $80 per ton. Brazilian crop agency CONAB has raised its forecast for its soybean and corn production for the 2021 growing season. As productivity and the area planted with both crops increased, Brazilian producers will raise 135 million metric tons of beans this season. That would be a record, according to the agency. Last month, the agency forecast a crop of 133.8 million tons, Brazil producing just shy of 125 million tons of beans last year. After scant rains early in the growing season, more precipitation starting in December and then through January helped the development of that crop, according to CONAB. Rains in the last couple of months have slowed harvesting work and have delayed planting of the second corn crop. CONAB raised its estimate for the area planted to soybeans by 0.5%, raising its forecast for productivity by the same amount. And the agency forecast a total Brazilian corn crop of 108 million metric tons, up from its February forecast of 105.5 million and from the 102.5 million tons produced in the previous year. CONAB raised its estimate for area planted by 2% from February and increased its forecast for corn productivity by 0.3%. Now, the desire by Brazil to plant corn even in a late season is one example of current market factors incentivizing producers around the world to increase corn acreage, according to a USDA economist. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
Global corn production is forecasted up 2.7% in March, per USDA's monthly supply and demand estimate. Yet World Agricultural Outlook Board Chair Mark Jekanowski says one nation not reflected in the month-over-month production forecast is Brazil. Although with a projected 109 million tons in production,
it would be record large, and it's driven largely by just a strong incentive to expand corn acreage, given how high prices are, especially local prices in local currency.
Despite late planting due to delays in harvest of Brazil's soybean crop. Corn production forecasts are also up for India and South Africa from the previous month. Nations not known as significant corn producers, however,
relatively tight global supplies and high global prices. Those countries, too, have incentive to produce corn and have the incentive and the wherewithal to expand their exports. So that's what we are also expecting to see.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And next up, this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop. Awaiting with that is Marcia Boswell.
Wheat fields are greening up across Kansas just in time for the 2021 National Wheat Yield Contest to open for grower enrollment. The contest features two primary competition categories, winter wheat and spring wheat, plus two subcategories, dryland and irrigated. The National Wheat Yield Contest showcases how management can maximize yield potential while maintaining excellent quality. The contest is organized by the National Wheat Foundation. The 2021 National Wheat Yield Contest sponsors include Agrimax, Ardent Mills, BASF, Cropland by Winfield United, Graincraft, John Deere, Miller Milling, Nutrien, and Westbred. According to National Wheat Foundation Board President and Texas wheat grower David Clevenger, we hope to continue to break our record of eligible entries and for the quality criteria to continue to make the contest more competitive. Again, the National Wheat Foundation would like to thank our sponsors for helping to make the contest available to all wheat growers across the United States, and DTN Progressive for providing exclusive coverage of the contest. The National Wheat Yield Contest awards the highest yielding entry from each state, from which national winners are selected. Subcategory winners are determined by yield increases exceeding the most recent 5-year Olympic County average, as determined by the USDA. Growers are also required to submit a grain sample from each entry to determine the quality of wheat produced under high yield management practices. A total of 24 national awards will be given, with winners from each category and subcategory recognized during the 2022 Commodity Classic, scheduled for March 10th through the 12th, 2022, in New Orleans, Louisiana. In the 2020 National Wheat Yield Contest, Tyler Ettinger from Meade earned the top spot in the dryland winter wheat category with a final yield of 108.43 bushels per acre. This plot also earned Ettinger a 5th place finish in the National Yield Contest in the dryland category based on a 205% increase over the county average. The variety for this winning entry was Westbred's 4792. In the irrigated winter wheat category, Kai Gamble from Kiowa was the state winner, with an entry of Westbred's 4792 that yielded 135.39 bushels per acre. The early registration deadline for this year's winter wheat contest is April 1st. The final deadline for entries is May 15th, so Kansas farmers still have time to evaluate which fields have the best yield potential for this year's harvest. The wheat contest is conducted online, so growers should register at yieldcontest.wheatfoundation.org. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
All right, Marcia, many thanks. Well, it's been a long time coming, a border-to-border rain event in Kansas. Mary Knapp will tell us about what to expect this weekend after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Rounding out this Agriculture Today, it's our regular visit with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp over to talk Kansas agricultural weather. Well, after an extremely blustery week, Mary, across Kansas at long last, we've a widespread rainfall event spreading across the state as we speak.
Right. This week has been warm and dry and windy, and that was an issue that we can go into later, but we've already started seeing the moisture from this cutoff low begin to infiltrate the state. There was a streak of rain in the southwest part of the state, not huge amounts. We're talking generally less than 1/10 of an inch, a little bit wider spread streak of moisture in the southeast part of the state where 3/4 of an inch or more we're seeing in areas. This morning we have a round of thunderstorms in south central Kansas. Some of it was severe with some penny-sized hail and, again, strong winds. What will be really of interest to the listeners is how that spreads over the next 3 days. And at that point, it's looking very, very promising for most of the state to see 1.5 inches to as much as 4 inches of moisture. And that includes the northwest, west central, where we still have that extreme drought in play.
And because this system will train over Kansas quite slowly, you tell us, this is going to be a soaker as opposed to a heavy runoff.
At this point, it looks like it's going to be a soaking event where that rain comes over the 3 to 4 day period. That's not to rule out the fact that some of these embedded storms might have some brief heavy downpours. They already have flood watches out for the south central and southeastern part of the state, moving into central and east central Kansas. But again, if you get that inch in an hour's time, you can have flooding anywhere. Our listeners should be alert to those potential flood risks and be prepared for that.
So welcome the rain, and those extraordinary winds are out of here. That was a rough week this past week around parts of Kansas.
Right. It was a very, very rough week. In particular, we had a lot of wildfires that plagued the area from north central to northeast, all around. You had a lot of fire companies trying to suppress the fires. In many cases, they would restart because the wind would fan a snag or a piece of burning timber and restart after they thought it was out. Hopefully the rains will dampen those and reduce the fire risk, at least for a couple of days. The unfortunate thing is that most of these are grass fires where they're what's known as 1-hour fuels. It only takes a short time to dry them back down to a dangerous level. So again, don't let your guard down as we move later into April. Be alert for those fire danger days as they are announced.
Then this rain will move out early next week, and the prospects for more moisture become what?
Well, actually, they go down. The 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks, which basically carry us through the end of March, are favoring drier than normal conditions for that time period. That doesn't mean we won't see some rains in it, but at this time we're ramping up the amount that we would expect on a daily basis. So if we get a brief drizzle through with a couple of hundredths of an inch, that won't match what we would expect on a daily basis and certainly wouldn't cover a weekly total. So again, doesn't preclude some storms in there, but it's unlikely to be a repeat of, if you want to call it, this miracle weekend here in March.
And on the temperature side, once more looking back, pretty warm readings around Kansas, and want to ask directly about the impact on our soil temperatures.
Well, we had warm temperatures. We were about 10 degrees warmer than normal statewide on average. We did see some warming of the soil. Some of them were reaching that 50-degree mark on a day-to-day basis, but that's not likely to continue. Moist soils are going to be slower to warm. They're likely to cool down with the cloudy, wet weather that we're expecting this weekend. And again, if there's adequate moisture in the soil, that again is going to slow any warming down. So you'll want to keep a watch on that. You can check out the mesonet.ksu.edu, look at the soil temperature page, and track how that's behaving over time. And we'll have an article in the Agronomy E-Update that discusses those ideal soil temperatures and the different factors that influence how quickly you can achieve them.
A couple of other things quickly before we wrap it up for today. La Nina, what's the latest?
Latest is that there's a good chance that we'll go into neutral by the end of the spring and have basically neutral conditions through the summer. The question is whether or not it will revert to a La Nina as we go into next fall, or if we'll progress to an El Nino. The difference between the two, first, neutral means that we're not really getting much guidance from the global pattern on what's going to be happening in Kansas. But if we go to a La Nina again, there's a very strong correlation for hotter and drier conditions, particularly in our fall. Our strongest signal from an ENSO event tend to be either in the fall or in the spring. It doesn't have as much influence during our summer months. On the other hand, if we get an El Nino out of it, El Ninos favor wetter than normal conditions for us. So we'll be watching that to see what develops, but at this time it's difficult to say which state that ENSO will be in.
And to remind folks, this is the weekend to move those clocks forward as daylight savings time kicks in, Mary.
Right. We'll lose an hour of sleep as we adjust our clocks to that. Most of our producers aren't locked to a 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 clock day, but we're moving into the spring. We're gaining about 2 minutes of daylight a day, and this is just going to shift when that is going to be on the official clock.
Enjoy the rainfall this weekend. Mary, thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp there, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. Thanks, as always, to you for being along with us. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over at the K-State Radio Network.